At dawn on a frozen Maryland back road, a surveyor paused beside disturbed frost, nodding tire impressions fading toward a tree line, the air holding its breath as deputies marked distances, gloved hands steady, radios silent, knowing December had preserved something waiting to be measured, photographed, and finally understood there. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. Maryland in December carries a particular quiet, especially away from the highways, where two-lane roads slip past farms, quarries, and dark stands of pine. In 1992, that quiet framed the discovery of 22-year-old Laura Anne Whitaker, a recent college graduate whose absence had unsettled Frederick County for nearly 3 weeks. Her name already appeared on photocopied flyers curling on grocery store bulletin boards, at post offices, and beside church vestibules decorated for Christmas. Those flyers showed a smiling young woman in a winter sweater, hair tucked behind one ear, a life paused between Thanksgiving and New Year's. Laura had last been seen on the evening of December 6, leaving a seasonal retail job at a shopping center outside Thurmont. Coworkers remembered her locking up, snow threatening but not yet falling, the air brittle with cold. She was expected at her parents' home in Walkersville the next morning to help trim a tree and plan a modest holiday gathering. When she did not arrive, the family waited through the day, then the night, then the next morning, assuming car trouble, a delayed ride, a miscommunication. By Sunday afternoon, assumptions gave way to formal concern, and a missing person report was filed with the Frederick County Sheriff's Office. The initial response followed familiar procedures of the era. Laura's car, a light blue compact sedan, was located within 48 hours in a commuter lot near Route 15, unlocked, keys missing, no visible damage. Parking receipts suggested it had been left overnight. Officers canvassed nearby businesses, collected statements, and logged times and dates into paper files that would later yellow in storage. There were no surveillance cameras covering the lot in 1992, only sodium vapor lights and the memory of passers-by who recalled nothing unusual during the cold weekend. December deepened. Christmas lights appeared along Market Street in Frederick, wreaths hung from lampposts, and local papers balanced holiday features with brief updates on Laura Whitaker's disappearance. The tone was restrained, factual, urging anyone with information to contact authorities. Tips came in as they often do, most leading nowhere. Friends were interviewed. A former boyfriend was noted and cleared. A supervisor confirmed Laura had not expressed fear or plans to leave town. Bank records showed no activity after December 6. Her social security number was not used. There was no evidence of voluntary disappearance. When the discovery occurred just before dawn on December 27, it was not dramatic in the way television would later portray such moments. It was procedural. A county employee surveying drainage patterns along a rural spur road noticed irregularities in the frost and a scattering of personal effects partially concealed by leaves. He stopped, documented the location, and contacted authorities. Deputies secured the area, noting the proximity to the Monocacy River watershed and the relative isolation of the site. The cold had slowed decomposition. Time, while relentless, had been moderated by winter. The medical examiner's involvement began that morning. The body was transported with care to the state lab in Baltimore. The preliminary assessment focused on identification, estimated time since death, and the absence of overt trauma inconsistent with environmental exposure. Autopsy findings would later indicate cause of death consistent with asphyxiation, with no sharp force injuries and no evidence suggesting prolonged struggle at the recovery site. Toxicology samples were taken. Fingernail scrapings were preserved. Fibers adhered to clothing were cataloged. Everything was logged, sealed, and labeled according to protocol that, at the time, relied heavily on handwritten tags. Investigators reconstructed Laura's final days through receipts, phone records, and interviews conducted in quiet living rooms still decorated with tinsel. She had worked additional hours due to the holiday rush. She planned to attend a small gathering with friends the weekend she vanished, but never arrived. On the night of December 6, phone logs showed a brief call placed from her workplace to a local number registered to a residence outside Emmitsburg. The owner of that number, a 33-year-old man named Thomas Eugene Keller, was an acquaintance through a mutual friend, known casually, not intimately. Keller was interviewed early in the investigation. He acknowledged receiving the call, stating Laura had asked about a used appliance he was selling, a minor detail that placed them in contact without implying closeness. He reported being home that evening, alone, watching television. There were no immediate contradictions. Without physical evidence linking him to a crime, and with limited forensic capabilities compared to later decades, the interview was logged and Keller was released from further scrutiny. The file thickened, then stalled. Winter passed into a gray Maryland spring. The Whitaker family buried Laura in early January, after a quiet service attended by classmates home on break and neighbors who brought casseroles and sympathy cards. The case was reclassified from missing person to homicide. Detectives revisited known facts, but momentum slowed. Leads dried up. By summer, the investigation shifted to a cold case status, though the term itself was not yet commonly used. Boxes were transferred to storage in a county building with climate control that was more aspiration than reality. For the community, life resumed its rhythms. The shopping center changed tenants. New flyers replaced old ones. Laura's parents established a small scholarship in her name at the community college she had attended, a gesture noted briefly in the local press. Each Thanksgiving, her absence sharpened. Each Christmas, an ornament remained unclaimed. For investigators, the file waited, inert but not forgotten, its potential tied to future methods not yet available. The 1990s progressed, bringing incremental changes to forensic science. DNA analysis matured from a promising technique to a practical tool. In Frederick County, a review of unsolved cases was initiated in the late 2000s, prompted by state grants aimed at addressing homicides left unresolved. Laura Whitaker's file was among those retrieved from archives. Evidence was inventoried anew. Some items had degraded, others remained intact. The fingernail scrapings, preserved and sealed, were deemed suitable for modern testing. By this time, the landscape had changed. What once required significant quantities of biological material could now be attempted with far less. Analysts extracted a partial male DNA profile from the preserved samples, sufficient for comparison. At first, it did not match any profiles in the combined DNA index system. The result was documented, the file updated, and the case remained technically unsolved, but newly alive. Investigators expanded their review, cross-referencing the DNA profile with names in the original file, focusing on individuals known to have had contact with Laura in the days before her death. Thomas Eugene Keller resurfaced in the paperwork. Now older, his address changed. His life marked by a series of minor offenses unrelated to violence. A court order was obtained for a DNA sample, collected lawfully during a probationary check related to an unrelated matter. The comparison, conducted in a state lab, produced a match with a probability so high it left no statistical ambiguity. The confirmation did not immediately translate into an arrest. Prosecutors required corroboration. Detectives revisited Keller's 1992 alibi, comparing it against newly obtained records and re-interviewing witnesses with the benefit of hindsight. Utility records placed him in the area that night. A former coworker recalled lending him a vehicle during the week Laura disappeared, a detail previously unmentioned and now verifiable through dated maintenance receipts. The appliance sales story unraveled under scrutiny. There had been no listing, no advertisement, no record of an item changing hands. As autumn approached and the 20th anniversary of Laura's death passed quietly, a grand jury convened. Evidence was presented methodically, without flourish. The DNA linkage, the timeline inconsistencies, the proximity, and the opportunity formed a coherent narrative grounded in documentation rather than speculation. In November, just before Thanksgiving, an indictment was issued. The arrest, carried out without incident, sent a measured shock through a community that had long assumed the case would remain unanswered. The arrest of Thomas Eugene Keller unfolded without spectacle. A weekday morning served with papers at a modest rental house outside Hagerstown, the kind of place overlooked by most people passing through. Deputies noted his compliance, his silence, the way he looked older than his years, hair thinned and shoulders rounded by time. He was transported to Frederick County without comment, processed according to procedure, and held pending arraignment. News traveled faster than the patrol cars, reaching coffee counters, barber shops, and the courthouse steps where reporters gathered with restrained language, careful not to overstate what had been proven and what still awaited judgment. For investigators, the work intensified rather than concluded. An arrest marked a threshold, not an ending. Detectives returned to physical evidence with renewed purpose, ensuring chain of custody documentation was intact and defensible. Each envelope was reviewed, each signature matched, each transfer accounted for. The winter of 2012 brought long hours in offices lit by fluorescents, heat humming, while outside the season echoed the one that had framed Laura Whitaker's final weeks 2 decades earlier. The parallels were not lost on those involved, though such reflections rarely appeared in official reports. Prosecutors assembled their case deliberately, mindful of the elapsed time and the scrutiny it invited. The DNA evidence formed the backbone, but it could not stand alone. Jurors would need context, motive, opportunity, and a narrative that explained how a young woman could vanish during the holidays without immediate resolution. To that end, investigators conducted recorded interviews with witnesses from 1992, many now retired, some reluctant, others eager to contribute whatever fragments memory had preserved. Statements were cross-checked against original notes, highlighting consistencies and addressing discrepancies. One interview proved particularly significant. A former neighbor of Keller, contacted during a routine canvass, recalled an unfamiliar car parked near Keller's residence on a cold December night in 1992, its engine ticking as if recently turned off. At the time, the observation had seemed inconsequential. Now, paired with records showing Laura's car abandoned elsewhere, the recollection gained weight. The neighbor could not identify the vehicle with precision, but the timing aligned with known movements, and the statement was documented with care, its limitations acknowledged. Autopsy findings were revisited by a forensic pathologist specializing in cold cases. The original conclusions were affirmed, with additional commentary explaining how winter conditions could obscure certain indicators without negating cause-of-death determinations. This expert prepared to testify, focusing on what could be stated confidently and what could not, an approach designed to withstand cross-examination. There was no embellishment, only measured explanation rooted in anatomy and physiology. Media coverage remained steady but subdued. Local papers ran follow-up pieces outlining the procedural steps leading to the arrest, often quoting officials who emphasized patience and methodical work. There were no dramatic headlines, only careful summaries. National outlets did not descend, and in some ways this restraint suited the community, allowing the process to unfold without intrusion. Laura Whitaker's parents issued a brief statement through the prosecutor's office, expressing gratitude for renewed attention and asking for privacy as the case moved forward. As winter gave way to another spring, pretrial motions occupied the court's calendar. Defense attorneys challenged the admissibility of the DNA evidence, questioning storage conditions and the potential for contamination. Each challenge was addressed in hearings marked by technical language and expert testimony. Records demonstrated that the evidence had been preserved according to standards of the time and handled appropriately during subsequent testing. The judge ruled the evidence admissible, noting the absence of credible indications of compromise. The defense also revisited Keller's original interview, arguing that investigators had overlooked other potential suspects. Prosecutors responded by presenting documentation of those early leads and the reasons they had been excluded. The court acknowledged the thoroughness of the initial investigation within the context of available resources, while recognizing the advances that ultimately allowed the case to progress. These rulings shaped the contours of the trial, narrowing its focus. Jury selection began in late October, coinciding with the first cold mornings of the season. Prospective jurors were questioned about their ability to weigh evidence from a decades-old case without bias. Many remembered the disappearance vaguely, if at all. Those selected were instructed on the importance of evaluating facts rather than nostalgia or speculation. The trial commenced with an emphasis on chronology, guiding jurors through December 1992 step by step. Prosecutors outlined Laura Whitaker's final known movements, supported by employment records, phone logs, and witness testimony. They presented the DNA findings with clarity, explaining probability in plain terms without resorting to exaggeration. The appliance story was dismantled through documentation showing its implausibility. The borrowed vehicle was introduced, corroborated by maintenance receipts and testimony. Each element was positioned as part of a cumulative picture, rather than a single decisive blow. The defense countered by emphasizing the passage of time, the fallibility of memory, and the absence of direct witnesses to the crime itself. They suggested alternative explanations for the DNA transfer, though none were supported by evidence specific to the case. Cross-examination sought to highlight uncertainties, but the tone remained professional, constrained by the factual record. Observers noted the quiet intensity of proceedings, the absence of theatrics. Throughout the trial, Laura's presence was conveyed through photographs, transcripts, and the testimony of those who had known her. There was no attempt to dramatize her life, only to establish its normalcy and the abruptness of its end. Jurors listened, took notes, and asked for clarifications through the judge when necessary. The process moved steadily, day by day, mirroring the methodical approach that had revived the investigation years earlier. Closing arguments returned to fundamentals. The prosecution summarized the evidence, stressing its interlocking nature and the improbability of coincidence. The defense reiterated reasonable doubt, urging caution in cases resurrected by new technology. The judge instructed the jury on the law, emphasizing the standard required for conviction. Deliberations began as leaves fell outside the courthouse, another seasonal marker aligning with the past. After 3 days, the jury returned. The verdict was delivered without flourish, guilty of second-degree murder. There was no audible reaction in the courtroom, only the sound of papers being gathered and the judge's measured acknowledgement. Sentencing was scheduled for December, a timing noted quietly by those present. For Laura Whitaker's family, the decision closed a chapter long left open, offering resolution without erasing loss. At sentencing, the court reviewed the impact statements and the defendant's history. Thomas Eugene Keller was sentenced to a term consistent with state guidelines, ensuring he would spend the remainder of his life in custody. The judge spoke briefly about accountability and the persistence of truth. Outside, the air was cold again, decorations beginning to appear along streets much as they had in 1992. In the weeks that followed, the case receded from headlines. Files were returned to archives, now marked solved. Investigators moved on to other work, carrying with them the reminder that patience and procedure could bridge decades. For the Whitaker family, the holidays remained altered, but no longer defined by unanswered questions. In a Maryland town accustomed to quiet endurance, the resolution settled in, acknowledged without ceremony, a measured ending to a long, restrained search for clarity. In the months following sentencing, the legal process continued in quieter rooms, far from cameras and holiday lights. Automatic appeals were filed as a matter of course, raising standard questions about evidence preservation, jury instructions, and proportionality of sentence. Each was addressed in written briefs that cited precedent rather than emotion. Appellate judges reviewed transcripts from yellowed pages now digitized, comparing testimony against established law. The conviction stood, affirmed without modification, reinforcing the conclusion that procedure, not passion, had carried the case to its end. For the Frederick County Sheriff's Office, the resolution prompted an internal review aimed at extracting lessons rather than assigning blame. Supervisors examined how the original investigation had unfolded in 1992, acknowledging constraints of technology and staffing common to the era. Training materials were updated to emphasize long-term evidence preservation, meticulous documentation, and the value of revisiting cases when new tools emerged. Laura Whitaker's file became part of that curriculum, referenced not by name during instruction but by case number, an example of persistence rewarded by time. The forensic laboratory issued its own summary, detailing how partial profiles once considered insufficient could later become decisive. Analysts emphasized the importance of maintaining integrity across decades, from freezer temperatures to transfer logs. The report circulated quietly among agencies, contributing to broader conversations about cold case funding and prioritization. There was no sense of triumph, only validation of incremental progress achieved through consistency. Community response unfolded gradually. In Walkersville, the Whitaker family home remained modest and unchanged, though the front yard bore signs of careful tending. Neighbors stopped by with cards during the holidays, expressing relief that answers had finally come. Conversations avoided speculation, focusing instead on remembrance. Laura's parents continued the scholarship established years earlier, now nodding in its description that justice, though delayed, had been served. Applications increased, a small testament to renewed attention. Local media revisited the case one final time near the anniversary of the arrest, publishing a retrospective that traced the investigation from disappearance to conviction. The tone remained measured, highlighting procedural milestones rather than dramatizing suffering. Editors were mindful of audience fatigue and the family's request for restraint. The article concluded by acknowledging the many cases still unresolved, framing this one as an exception earned through circumstance and diligence. As Thanksgiving approached that year, courthouse activity slowed, calendars clearing for brief recesses. Clerks filed remaining motions, and judges issued routine orders. In the quiet hallways, the Whitaker case was already receding into administrative memory, its documents archived under resolved status. Yet for those who had worked it, the seasonal timing lingered. Many noted privately how the investigation had begun and ended against the same backdrop of shortening days and early darkness. Correctional intake records documented Keller's transfer to a state facility, his sentence commencing without incident. Psychological evaluations recorded no extraordinary findings, only the expected adjustments of an older inmate entering long-term confinement. He filed no public statements. The system absorbed him as it does others, reducing a once-noted name to an identification number. From a legal standpoint, the matter was closed. Years passed. Frederick County changed incrementally, as towns do. New businesses replaced old storefronts. Roads were widened, signage updated. The commuter lot where Laura's car had been found was resurfaced and restripped, its history unmarked. For residents who remembered, the knowledge persisted quietly, detached from physical reminders. Younger generations learned of the case, if at all, through parents or archived articles accessed online. Law enforcement conferences occasionally referenced the investigation when discussing cold case methodologies. Presentations focused on timelines, decision points, and the disciplined use of emerging databases. Attendees took notes, recognizing familiar challenges within their own jurisdictions. Laura Whitaker's story, stripped of personal detail in those settings, served as a template rather than a narrative, illustrating how patience could align with innovation. For the Whitaker family, time softened but did not erase. Holidays remained moments of reflection, the absence still present but contextualized by resolution. They marked anniversaries privately, choosing not to engage with media inquiries that surfaced sporadically. In conversations with close friends, they spoke of gratitude for those who had not forgotten, and of relief that uncertainty no longer overshadowed memory. On the investigative side, the case influenced resource allocation. Grant proposals cited its outcome as justification for continued funding of cold case units. Legislators, reviewing summaries, noted the tangible results of sustained investment. Budgets reflected cautious optimism, balancing fiscal limits with the demonstrated value of revisiting dormant files. The process was incremental, mirroring the investigative philosophy it supported. By the 30th anniversary of Laura Whitaker's disappearance, the case had settled into a different kind of permanence. It appeared in databases as solved, in training manuals as instructive, and in family history as a chapter concluded. There were no monuments, no plaques, only records maintained according to policy. That understated conclusion aligned with the manner in which the truth had emerged, without spectacle. Winter returned again, as it always does in Maryland, bringing early sunsets and quiet roads edged with frost. The season no longer carried unanswered questions tied to Laura's name, only the acknowledgement of what had occurred and what had been done. In the measured language of reports and rulings, the case stood complete, a reminder that even after decades, methodical work could restore order to a narrative interrupted by violence. The broader impact remained subtle but real. Families of other victims reached out to authorities, encouraged by the outcome to inquire about dormant cases. Investigators responded carefully, setting expectations while offering transparency. Not every file would yield answers, but the commitment to review them persisted. In that sense, the Whitaker case extended beyond itself, influencing approaches without claiming to represent a universal outcome. As years layered upon one another, the case receded further into archives, its digital footprint maintained but seldom accessed. Those who encountered it did so through purpose rather than chance, seeking guidance or precedent. The community carried on, informed but not defined by the past. Seasonal rituals continued, Thanksgiving dinners served, Christmas lights hung, New Year's marked with quiet resolutions. In the end, the resolution of the Maryland 1992 cold case did not alter the fundamental loss at its center. It provided clarity, accountability, and a lawful conclusion grounded in evidence and procedure. For a town accustomed to endurance, that was sufficient. The record closed, the files rested, and the winter air moved on, indifferent yet bearing witness to a truth finally confirmed. Even after the appeals process concluded and administrative closure was entered into the system, the case continued to exert a quiet gravity on those who had encountered it professionally. Detectives who had joined the department long after 1992 read through the file during training rotations, absorbing the cadence of an investigation shaped by limitations and later redeemed by persistence. The tone of the report stood out to them, restrained and factual, devoid of speculation, a record of decisions made with the information available at each moment in time. The sheriff's office implemented periodic audits of older evidence rooms, prompted in part by lessons drawn from the Whitaker case. Boxes were relabeled, inventories digitized, temperature controls upgraded. These changes were not attributed publicly to any single case, but internally the connection was understood. The idea that a single preserved envelope could one day alter the course of justice reinforced a culture of care that extended beyond active investigations. In Frederick County's courthouse, clerks who had processed paperwork during the trial retired or moved on, replaced by younger staff who knew the case only as a reference number. Yet the docket entries remained, time-stamped reminders of a process carried out methodically across decades. Judges occasionally cited the appellate opinion in rulings related to evidence admissibility, its language precise and unembellished, reinforcing standards rather than recounting history. Outside institutional settings, the case occupied a different space. Local historical societies archived newspaper clippings and broadcast transcripts, categorizing them under regional crime history. Researchers studying the evolution of forensic science in Maryland referenced the investigation as an example of transitional eras, bridging pre-digital policing and modern analysis. The narrative, stripped of emotion in those contexts, became a study in process. The Whitaker Scholarship continued to be awarded annually, announced quietly at the community college where Laura had once planned her future. Recipients were informed of its origin in brief, respectful terms. Some reached out to the family with letters of thanks, gestures acknowledged but not publicized. In this way, Laura's name persisted in association with opportunity rather than solely loss. Each December, as decorations returned to storefronts and church lawns, those who remembered 1992 marked the season differently. The intersection of holiday routine and the anniversary of discovery remained a private reckoning. Law enforcement agencies did not issue statements, and the family did not seek recognition. The absence of ritual underscored the case's resolution as complete, not in need of commemoration to validate it. Thomas Eugene Keller's presence within the correctional system diminished into routine. Annual reviews documented compliance and age-related health considerations. There were no disciplinary incidents of note. His file contained the same elements as countless others, his crime contextualized legally but not revisited narratively. From the system's perspective, justice had been administered and resources shifted elsewhere. Cold case units across Maryland periodically reviewed their rosters, weighing solvability against available manpower. The Whitaker case served as a reminder that even files long considered dormant could hold latent potential. Investigators balanced optimism with realism, aware that not every preserved sample would yield a profile, not every profile a name. Still, the commitment to review endured, supported by measured expectations. In the broader criminal justice landscape, the case contributed incrementally to policy discussions about statutes of limitation, evidence retention, and funding. Legislators referenced aggregated outcomes rather than individual stories, but the underlying data included Laura Whitaker's case among those demonstrating the value of long-term investment. The resulting policies favored sustained archival maintenance, a shift away from earlier practices that prioritized only active files. As technology continued to evolve, new methods emerged, including advanced genealogical analysis. Agencies debated their use, weighing privacy concerns against investigative potential. In Frederick County, protocols were updated cautiously, informed by experiences like the Whitaker investigation, where lawful, consent-based DNA comparison had proven sufficient. The emphasis remained on restraint and adherence to established legal frameworks. Time continued its steady passage. Residents who had once followed the case aged, some passing away, others relocating. Newcomers to the county encountered the story only if they sought it out. The physical landscape bore few traces of what had occurred decades earlier. Roads were repaved, signage replaced, wooded areas altered by development. The site of discovery, never marked, blended back into its surroundings. For those studying criminology, the case illustrated how narratives could remain incomplete without technological advancement, and how restraint in early reporting preserved credibility over time. The absence of sensational language in original media coverage later strengthened public trust when resolution came. This restraint, noted in academic analyses, contrasted with trends toward dramatization elsewhere. In family photo albums, Laura Whitaker remained young, preserved in images taken before her disappearance. Those images, shared occasionally among relatives, carried less of the sharp uncertainty that once accompanied them. Resolution did not transform grief into something else, but it altered its texture, allowing memory to exist without unanswered questions pressing at its edges. By the 40th anniversary, if it comes to be noted at all, the case will likely be referenced briefly, a line in a database or a footnote in training materials. That understated persistence aligns with the way the investigation concluded, through documentation rather than declaration. The community's response, muted and respectful, reflects an understanding that closure does not require amplification. The Maryland winter continues to arrive each year with familiar signs: frost on fields, early sunsets, roads edged with bare trees. Those conditions once preserved evidence long enough for truth to emerge. Now they pass without association, part of a cycle indifferent to human timelines. The case rests within the systems designed to hold it, complete and verified. In this way, the story of the Maryland 1992 cold case stands not as an anomaly, but as a testament to procedural endurance. It affirms that careful preservation, lawful investigation, and patience can intersect even after decades. The resolution does not rewrite the past, but it establishes a clear record, one that remains intact as years continue to move forward, steady and unremarkable, carrying with them the quiet certainty that this search, at least, reached its end. With the final administrative steps completed, the Maryland 1992 cold case entered a phase that rarely receives attention, the long quiet that follows formal closure. There were no press conferences announcing anniversaries, no renewed debates about guilt or innocence. The record stood firm, supported by evidence tested under law and affirmed through appeal. For those who had lived with uncertainty for years, that stability mattered more than public acknowledgement. In Frederick County, the case became part of institutional memory, referenced when appropriate, then set aside. Detectives rotated through assignments, some retiring, others advancing, carrying lessons forward without ceremony. The Whitaker file, once thick with unanswered questions, now rested complete, its pages no longer added to, its margins no longer marked with speculation. It remained accessible, preserved like all closed cases, but no longer active in any practical sense. The community adjusted in ways both subtle and visible. Older residents, when asked, spoke of the case in past tense, with the assurance that comes from resolution. Conversations no longer ended with uncertainty, but with confirmation of outcome. Younger residents, if they learned of it at all, encountered it as history rather than mystery. The transition from open wound to scar was gradual, marked not by a single moment but by accumulated acceptance. For the Whitaker family, daily life continued without public milestones. They declined interviews, declined invitations to speak, choosing instead to live privately with the knowledge that the system had worked, even if slowly. They maintained their routines, attended community events when they wished, and marked holidays quietly. Thanksgiving dinners and Christmas mornings remained bittersweet, but no longer carried the weight of unanswered fear. The absence remained, but clarity replaced speculation. In law enforcement circles beyond the county, the case was cited occasionally in professional discussions, not as an extraordinary success, but as an example of adherence to procedure over time. It demonstrated how restraint in early investigation, careful preservation, and lawful adaptation to new technology could converge decades later. The absence of shortcuts became part of its significance, reinforcing standards rather than challenging them. The courthouse, where the verdict had been read and sentence imposed, returned to its usual rhythm. Other cases filled the docket, each with its own complexities. Clerks archived transcripts, judges moved on, and jurors returned to their lives. The Whitaker trial became one among many concluded matters, its significance contextual rather than singular. As years progressed, the cultural environment surrounding crime reporting continued to change. Sensational coverage became more common elsewhere, but in Frederick County, local media retained a measured tone shaped by past experience. Editors remembered how restraint had preserved credibility, and younger reporters learned that not every resolved case required dramatization. The Whitaker case influenced that ethos quietly, without explicit acknowledgement. The physical places connected to the investigation continued to evolve. The rural road where Laura had been found blended further into its surroundings, unmarked and unremarked. The shopping center where she last worked saw renovations, new signage, new tenants. The commuter lot where her car had been abandoned served thousands of drivers unaware of its history. These changes reflected the natural passage of time rather than deliberate forgetting. Within state records, the case contributed to statistical reporting. It appeared in annual summaries as a cleared homicide, its resolution date logged decades after the offense. Analysts studying clearance rates noted it as an outlier, solved long after the national average window. Yet it also appeared as evidence that clearance was not limited strictly by time, but by the preservation of possibility. The correctional system continued to manage Thomas Eugene Keller without distinction. Annual assessments noted aging, medical needs, compliance. He remained incarcerated under the sentence imposed, his legal avenues exhausted. The system's engagement with him was administrative rather than narrative, consistent with its mandate. There were no revisitations of guilt, no public statements, only routine documentation. In academic settings, the case occasionally appeared in coursework addressing cold case methodology. Students reviewed timelines, examined decision points, and discussed how evolving technology intersected with unchanged legal principles. Laura Whitaker's name was sometimes mentioned, sometimes replaced by initials, depending on instructional context. The focus remained on process rather than personal detail. For investigators who had reopened the case years after the crime, its resolution reinforced professional identity. It validated the decision to revisit dormant files, to question assumptions without abandoning rigor. Some carried that experience into subsequent reviews, approaching older cases with renewed patience. Others recognized its limits, understanding that not all files would yield similar outcomes. Season after season passed. Maryland winters came and went, each resembling the last in their gray restraint. Frost still formed on fields, roads still quieted in early morning. These conditions once preserved critical evidence long enough to matter. Now they passed without association, part of a landscape no longer tied to uncertainty. In the broader sense, the case underscored the slow alignment between human systems and time. Justice did not arrive quickly, nor did it announce itself loudly. It emerged through accumulation, through records maintained, through evidence kept intact long after immediate relevance had faded. That alignment, once achieved, remained stable. The Whitaker family continued their scholarship quietly, never expanding it into a public campaign. It existed as a modest offering, a reminder of a life interrupted but not erased. Recipients often learned only the basics, enough to understand its origin without carrying its burden. In this way, memory was transferred gently, without imposing grief. As digital archives expanded, the case became easier to locate for those who sought it. Documents once stored in boxes now existed as scanned files, accessible but not prominent. Researchers could trace the investigation end to end, noting its consistency. That accessibility ensured transparency without reviving controversy. By the time 3 decades had passed since Laura Whitaker's disappearance, the case had settled fully into record. It was no longer discussed actively, but it was not forgotten. It occupied a defined place, neither exaggerated nor minimized. Its resolution stood as fact, its process as example. In the end, the Maryland 1992 cold case resolved not with dramatic revelation but with procedural certainty. Evidence linked lawfully, decisions made carefully, outcomes reviewed and affirmed. The community absorbed the conclusion without spectacle, the family carried it privately, and the system recorded it permanently. What remained was not a story of mystery, but a record of endurance. A young woman's life ended during a season meant for gathering and reflection. The truth of that ending emerged slowly, preserved by winter and by discipline. When it did, it altered nothing about the loss, but it restored order to the record. The files now rest, complete and closed, among thousands of others. The roads continue to carry traffic, the seasons continue their cycle, and the town continues forward. In that continuity lies the final measure of resolution, not in noise or attention, but in the quiet certainty that this case, once unresolved, reached its lawful end.